Hola, Jodos, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving into a topic that I know is on everyone's minds: security in Europe following the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Absolutely. A complex topic with a lot of moving pieces, but that's why it's so important to understand.
Exactly. And to help guide us through this deep dive, we have an incredible article from the Revista Giadis by Giuseppe Kojak Gangi Gillian.
Oh,
He is an expert on international humanitarian law and also the director of a master's program at the Universidad Antonio Nebrisha.
a true authority on the subject. His analysis is really in-depth.
Yeah, and what we want to do today is unpack the interplay between NATO, the European Union, and the United States to understand how they're shaping the security landscape in Europe.
Sounds fascinating. Where do we begin?
Well, let's start with something that blew my mind when I was reading the article. Did you know that since the fall of the Soviet Union, a huge number of countries have joined NATO?
Of course, the expansion of NATO has been a constant process since the end of the Cold War.
Exactly, but the number is really striking. Uh, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, even Finland and Sweden have joined.
Right.
It's a massive transformation.
And of course, this has created a lot of tension with Russia, who sees it as a direct threat to their security, especially the potential accession of Ukraine.
You can imagine from the Russian perspective, it was like NATO is encircling their territory.
Precisely. And many experts, including the author of the article, point to this expansion as one of the triggers behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in 2022.
Which in turn has led to the militarization of Europe. NATO has beefed up its presence on the eastern flank, and the support to Ukraine, both military and logistical, has been pretty impressive.
However, as Gangi Gian points out in his article, this response, although necessary, has intensified the confrontation between Russia and the West. It's a delicate game of deterrence and diplomacy.
And in this game, the U.S. role is key. They have been spearheading the expansion of NATO and providing unwavering support to Ukraine.
Their goal has been clear: to reinforce the liberal world order and maintain stability in Europe. Think about the sheer amount of military and logistical aid they've sent to Ukraine, including state-of-the-art missile systems.
Right, and this is where it gets interesting, that Ganjikian argues that this strategy has paradoxically fueled tensions with Russia.
Exactly. A thought-provoking point that invites us to reflect on the long-term consequences of U.S. actions in the region.
Plus, there's a growing debate within the United States itself about the cost and sustainability of the support for Ukraine, especially with a greater focus on the Asia-Pacific.
Absolutely. This leads us to a fundamental question. What roles will NATO and the European Union play in this new geopolitical scenario?
That's a great question. Are they really a power duo, as some people say?
Well, NATO and the EU have distinct but complementary roles. NATO focuses on collective defense and military deterrence, while the EU focuses on diplomacy and economic power.
Kind of like the brawn and the brain. One provides the strength, the other one the strategy.
Exactly. Perfect analogy. And although they have always collaborated, the war in Ukraine has forced them to work closer than ever before. Think about the unprecedented sanctions that the EU has imposed on Russia, or the financial and humanitarian support they've provided to Ukraine.
Right. And on the other hand, NATO has stepped up its military presence in Eastern Europe, a coordinated show of force.
Without a doubt. But here comes a key question that Gangi Gilan also raises in his article. Can the EU truly become a security powerhouse without a unified foreign policy?
That's the big question. Because so far, the EU has largely depended on NATO and the US for its security.
Precisely. And although there are initiatives like Permanent Structured Cooperation or PESCO, which seeks to deepen defense collaboration among EU countries, there's still a long way to go.
Wait, explain PESCO a little bit more for those of us who are not familiar with the military jargon.
Sure. PESCO is a framework that allows willing EU countries to collaborate on specific defense projects. For example, jointly developing new weapon systems or improving the interoperability of their armed forces.
I see. It's like a mini NATO within the EU.
In a way, yes. And there's also the European Defense Fund, which finances research and development into new military technologies.
So the EU is taking steps towards becoming more self-reliant in terms of defense.
Correct. But as Gangi Gyun points out, this process is not without risks. On one hand, the weakening of U.S. support could embolden Russia, increasing the pressure on European security.
It's like they're testing the waters, seeing how far they can go.
Exactly. And on the other hand, the EU's quest for greater autonomy could generate tensions within NATO, especially if some European countries start to question the need for the alliance.
Gogian mentions an event that illustrates these tensions very well: The meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance at the White House in February 2025.
Yes, a meeting that exposed the cracks in transatlantic cooperation. Apparently, Ukraine's demands for a ceasefire without security guarantees and the cancellation of some strategic agreement created a lot of tension with the U.S.
Which leads to a complicated situation. On the one hand, the EU needs to bolster its own defense, but on the other hand, it cannot risk weakening the transatlantic alliance.
It's a delicate balance, and that's precisely why it's so important to understand the dynamics at play.
And this is where international humanitarian law comes in, right?
Exactly. The conflict in Ukraine has not only highlighted existing geopolitical tensions, but has also underscored the growing importance of international humanitarian law, or IHL.
A subject that sometimes seems distant, but actually has a very real impact on people's lives, especially in conflict situations.
Absolutely. IHL seeks to protect people who are not taking part in hostilities and to limit the methods and means of warfare.
And in today's context, with the use of drones, artificial intelligence, and hybrid tactics, the application of IHL becomes even more complex.
Without a doubt, modern warfare presents unprecedented challenges for IHL. Consider, for example, the ethical and legal dilemmas posed by the use of autonomous weapons.
Weapons that can make lethal decisions without human intervention. Sounds like science fiction, but it's already a reality.
Precisely. Or the difficulty of identifying combatants in an environment where the lines between civilians and military are becoming increasingly blurred.
And of course, the proliferation of misinformation and propaganda, making the work of humanitarian organizations even more difficult.
It's a complex landscape that demands a constant update of legal frameworks and strategies to protect the civilian population. And this is where the work of experts like Giuseppe Kajak-Gangi becomes crucial.
His article in Revista Giadis invites us to reflect on these challenges and to seek solutions that ensure respect for IHL, even in the most complex conflicts.
Exactly. It's a must-read to understand the legal and humanitarian dimensions of the war in Ukraine and its implications for the future.
It's actually quite concerning to think about how these new technologies and tactics are blurring the lines of war.
You're right. And this brings us back to the question we were asking before. What does the future hold for global security? After analyzing the expansion of NATO, the role of the U.S., the dynamics of the European Union, and the importance of IHL, it seems that we are facing a constantly changing geopolitical chessboard.
Totally. And these changes force us to evaluate different scenarios. On the one hand, we see a Europe that seeks its strategic autonomy, driven by the need to strengthen its defense against the Russian threat.
Exactly. And at the same time, we are witnessing how the transatlantic relationship is being redefined, with the United States showing signs of a possible strategic withdrawal.
And that leads to even more complex questions. Will the European Union be able to fill the void left by the U.S. in terms of security? Will we see an intensification of geopolitical competition between the great powers?
These are difficult questions to answer, but Gangi-Gian's article offers us some clues to analyze them. For example, he warns us about the need to strike a balance between strategic autonomy and transatlantic cooperation.
So Europe can't just cut ties with the United States and go on a solo adventure.
Exactly. While it is important for Europe to take a more leading role in its own defense, it is also essential to maintain cohesion with the United States and NATO. Global security is based on a system of alliances and international cooperation, and that's something we must not forget.
And in this context, the conflict in Ukraine becomes a turning point. The response of the international community to Russian aggression will set a precedent for the future.
Without a doubt. And we cannot forget the impact this conflict is having on international humanitarian law. The use of new technologies, hybrid tactics, disinformation, all of this poses unprecedented challenges for the protection of civilians.
It's like we're entering a new era of warfare, with rules that are not yet clear.
You're right. And that is why it is so important to strengthen legal frameworks and humanitarian strategies, adapting them to the realities of modern warfare. We must ensure that IHL remains relevant and effective in this new context.
Ultimately, we are at a historical moment where the decisions made today will have long-term consequences.
Absolutely. And the question this deep dive leaves us with, and that Gangi-Gian's analysis leaves us with, is whether the international community will be up to the challenge.
I think that's a question each of us has to answer. We invite you to continue reflecting on this issue and to delve deeper into Giuseppe Kajak-Gangi-Gian's analysis in Revista Giadis. Subscribe to the magazine for access to more quality content on geopolitics and international relations. It's completely free. Thank you for joining us on this dive, and see you next time.
So the EU is taking steps toward becoming more self-reliant when it comes to defense.
Right. But as Gangi Gillian points out, this process has its share of risks.
Yes.
On one hand, the weakening of U.S. support could embolden Russia, increasing the pressure on European security.
It's like they're testing the water, seeing how far they can go.
Exactly. And on the other hand, the EU's quest for greater autonomy could create tensions within NATO, especially if some European countries begin to question the need for the alliance.
That's right. It could lead to a sort of division within NATO, with some members prioritizing the EU's defense initiatives over NATO's collective defense commitments.
So there's potential for disagreement there.
Exactly.
And Gangi Gillian actually brings up a specific event that really illustrates these tensions. The meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance at the White House in February 2025.
Ah, yes, a meeting that really exposed the cracks in transatlantic cooperation.
And what happened there?
Well, apparently, Ukraine's demands for a ceasefire without any security guarantees and the cancellation of some strategic agreements created a lot of tension with the U.S. It seems like there was a clash of expectations and priorities.
So essentially, Ukraine wanted a ceasefire, but the U.S. wasn't ready to provide the level of security guarantees that Ukraine was looking for.
Yes. And according to the article, there were disagreements about the terms of these agreements and whether they were actually beneficial for all parties involved.
So it seems like this meeting, instead of bringing the parties closer together, actually highlighted their differences.
Exactly. And it also showed that the U.S.'s commitment to European security might not be as unwavering as it once was.
So that leads us to a pretty tricky situation. On one hand, the EU needs to beef up its own defense, but on the other, it can't afford to weaken the transatlantic alliance.
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And that's precisely why it's so important to understand all these dynamics, the motivations, the interests, the historical context, all these things, because it's not a simple black and white situation.
It's very nuanced.
Very nuanced.
And this is where international humanitarian law comes into play.
Right.
Because the conflict in Ukraine has not only highlighted those existing geopolitical tensions, it's also underscored the growing importance of international humanitarian law, or IHL.
Exactly. IHL is crucial in ensuring that even in the midst of conflict, basic human rights and dignity are upheld.
And it seeks to protect people who aren't taking part in the fighting and to limit the methods and means of warfare.
It basically sets limits on what's acceptable in war, even though war itself is inherently brutal and destructive.
Yeah, and in today's world, with the increasing use of things like drones, artificial intelligence, and hybrid tactics, the application of IHL is even more complex.
Absolutely. Modern warfare presents these unprecedented challenges for IHL. For instance, you have the ethical and legal dilemmas posed by the use of autonomous weapons.
Weapons that can make lethal decisions without human intervention.
Yeah. It raises so many questions about accountability and control. Who's responsible when an autonomous weapon makes a mistake?
Right. That's something we definitely need to grapple with.
Absolutely. And then there's also the challenge of identifying combatants in a battlefield where the lines between civilians and the military are increasingly blurred.
Which makes it harder to apply IHL principles.
Exactly. It makes it incredibly difficult to distinguish between legitimate targets and those who should be protected under IHL.
And of course, let's not forget the proliferation of misinformation and propaganda online. It's become a whole other battlefront in modern warfare.
Right. It's become so hard to discern truth from falsehood, and this makes it even more difficult for humanitarian organizations to operate effectively.
And that's why the work of experts like Giuseppe Gangi Gillian is so important.
Yeah.
His article in Revista Geodese invites us to really think about these challenges and to search for solutions that ensure respect for IHL, even in these really complex and messy conflicts.
His analysis is extremely valuable. He doesn't just present the problems, he actually offers some concrete proposals for strengthening legal frameworks and humanitarian strategies to better protect civilians in modern warfare.
Yeah, and he really emphasizes the need to adapt those legal frameworks and strategies to the realities of modern warfare. We can't be stuck in the past. We have to evolve with the times. So we really are in a sort of uncharted territory when it comes to the laws of war in this new era.
Yes, and it brings us back to the question we were asking before, what does the future hold for global security? We've looked at the expansion of NATO, the role of the U.S., the dynamics of the European Union, the importance of IHL, and it seems like we are facing a really dynamic and constantly changing geopolitical chessboard.
Absolutely, and those changes, they really force us to kind of think about different scenarios that could unfold. On the one hand, we're seeing Europe really seeking that strategic autonomy of its own. driven by this need to strengthen its own defenses against Russia.
Right, and at the same time, we see the transatlantic relationship, being redefined as the U.S. shows signs of a possible strategic withdrawal from the region.
So that leads us to even more complex questions. Will the EU be able to step up and fill that void that the U.S. might leave behind when it comes to security? Will we see an intensification of geopolitical competition between those big powers?
Those are really tough questions to answer, but Gungi Gilen's article, it does offer us some clues to analyze them. For example, he warns us about the need to find that right balance between strategic autonomy and transatlantic cooperation.
So Europe can't just, completely cut ties with the U.S. and go off on its own adventure.
Exactly. It is important for Europe to take on a more prominent role in its own defense, for sure, but it's also essential to maintain that cohesion with the U.S. and with NATO. Global security, it really relies on a system of alliances and international cooperation, and that's something that we can't forget that.
Right. And, in this context, the conflict in Ukraine is really a turning point. How the international community responds to Russia's aggression, it really will set a precedent for the future.
Without a doubt. And we can't forget the impact that this conflict has on international humanitarian law, right? The use of new technologies, hybrid tactics, disinformation, all of this poses these unprecedented challenges when it comes to protecting civilians.
It really feels like we are, stepping into this new era of warfare where the rules aren't so clear.
You're right, and that's why it's so important to strengthen those legal frameworks and those humanitarian strategies and to adapt them to the new realities of modern warfare. We have to ensure that IHL remains relevant and effective in this, new context.
So ultimately, we are at this crucial moment in history where the decisions made today will have those long-term impacts.
Absolutely. And the question this deep dive leaves us with, and that Gungi Gilen's analysis really leaves us with, is will the international community rise to meet this challenge?
I think that's a question we each have to grapple with and consider. We invite you to continue reflecting on these really important questions and to dive deeper into Giuseppe Gungi Gilen's analysis in Revista Geodes. Be sure to subscribe to the magazine for access to even more insightful content on geopolitics and international relations. It's completely free. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.